It feels like we've been waiting months, with Sony and Microsoft in the longest game of poker that we could possibly have imagined. But finally, both companies have revealed the specifications of their respective upcoming next-generation consoles. But despite the fact that these specifications are now in the eyes of the public, well, there's still an awful lot of confusion exactly how these two machines stack up against one another. So that's the purpose of this video series then. That's right, this is going to be the first of several videos where I break down the key technical elements of both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and provide you insight in how they compare against one another. The purpose of this video series is kind of an overview, where I want to make it as simple and easy to understand as possible. To this end, I won't be going super duper technical, but instead to make it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. In the future, we will go much deeper and a lot more, let's say, technical. Because also that brings me to another point. While we know things like CPU clock frequency and roughly the configuration of the GPU, the amount of memory, and so on, there are a number of questions which remain unanswered. For example, what exactly is the operating system reserve for the PlayStation 5? Mark Cerny hasn't provided that information yet. How does boost frequency exactly work in terms of if there's a heavy CPU load? What exactly does it do to the GPU frequency? Now, Mark Cerny did provide some basic insight into this, but exact figures are still thin on the ground. I have, however, extrapolated some data, and I will discuss it in this video, but of course, as we learn about both next-generation consoles, we will be able to fill this in with much finer detail. Also, a little bit about me. By the way, I'm Paul, and I've owned every single Xbox console, including the Xbox One X. I was about to say Xbox Series X, which would be very impressive. All of the PlayStation consoles, including the PS4 Pro. I own a Nintendo Switch, I'm primarily a PC gamer, and I've been gaming for quite a while. I will also buy both next-generation consoles, assuming they have a pretty decent launch, which ultimately is probably going to be the thing which mostly persuades you to purchase one system or the other, and that is games, and ecosystem, along with, of course, the price. For example, let's say that you're an Xbox gamer, you've owned Xbox 360, you own an Xbox One X, and you have lots of friends online, you like the Microsoft ecosystem. It's going to take something pretty special from Sony to convince you, nope, I'm going to go with Sony this generation, and vice versa is also true. I know people who have been gaming on the PlayStation since the original. It's going to take an awful lot to convince someone, actually, you know what, I'm going to give Sony a miss this generation. I'm going to go with the Xbox instead. So I feel that is going to be of paramount importance. Also, both next-generation consoles are going to be extremely impressive. However, for a geek like me, there are some fundamental differences in how both Sony and Microsoft have approached the design of their systems. And I don't think that this is one of those things where Sony or Microsoft actually compromised their vision. Obviously, they did have to work within certain constraints. A console cannot cost the end user several thousand US, but what it can do is provide an awful lot of performance for a specific price point. And I think to that end, both Sony and Microsoft have done a very good job of engineering their vision of the future. Anyway, enough of this, let's get into it. The CPU is of course the heart of the machine, and the weedy Jaguar cores of the last generation were a noose around the necks of developers for high frame rates and being able to craft deep, immersive worlds. Don't believe me? You want evidence? Well, do you remember Assassin's Creed Unity near the console launch? The PS4 actually had worse performance at launch than the Xbox. We actually did frame rate tests back then, because despite the weaker GPU of the Xbox did sport a faster CPU, 1600 MHz for the PS4 versus 1750 of the Xbox One base model. Developers had reportedly expected faster CPUs in the last generation, and so, quite frequently, the dense crowd of Assassin's Creed Unity were just too much for either console's processors. Subsequent patches helped improve this by trimming down the number of NPCs. You can actually test this yourself if you own the game on Blu-ray. run an unpatched copy on the enhanced consoles, and the faster CPU helps lock the game to a higher frame rate. I stress though, it needs to be unpatched, as the patched version changes the game's code to reduce the number of NPCs. Also, while there is a lot of talk for T-flops of both machines, and we'll get further into the GPU in just a moment, the CPUs and the SSD will cover more of the SSD in part 2 of this, along with 3D audio and other things, will be just as critical of defining what's possible for the next generation. The Xbox Series X has an 8-core 16-thread processor which can run in 2 modes, SMT on or off. With off, the clock frequency increases by 200 MHz to 3800. With SMT disabled, the clock frequency then is just 3600 MHz. Sony though use an 8-core 16-thread CPU with up to 3500 MHz clock speed, which is the max frequency, but it can be lower. Again, we'll talk about that more in a moment. Let's discuss though why SMT on or off is available for the Xbox. SMT essentially allows 2 threads to run per core, and you may be more familiar with the term hyperthreading, as that's Intel's language for SMT. The current generation consoles sport 8 Jaguar cores, with games typically designed around having access to 7 cores, meaning that in essence game engines are typically designed for only several threads. More threads and performance equal good, of course, but it also means developers need more time to optimize the code to take advantage of this additional horsepower. And also, while SMT may on paper seem like it's doubling the performance, it's doubling the threads. Keeping things simple, those threads share execution resources, and depending on the application you may see a 30 or 50% improvement in performance. That is depending on if the application is fully leveraging the 8 physical threads with SMT disabled. If you have a PC and are comfortable tinkering around with the BIOS, you can download Cinebench, it's free, and run multi-core and single-core benchmarks. Reboot, then disable SMT or hyperthreading. You'll need a CPU and BIOS which is capable of supporting this. A CPU such as the 3700X from AMD or Intel's 8700K would be great examples, and then run the tests again. Note the difference in scores. This is of course an extreme case, after all you're comparing a single thread result, but when consoles first launch it will take time for developers to get the most out of games. We actually recently did testing with the help of Intel. They provided an i9-9900K for CPU scaling across multiple processor cores in current games and also showing the difference with modern APIs. I'm showing a few results here, though you can find the full link in the video description. Games now just are not designed to fully leverage a whole host of CPU performance and power, but this will definitely change as the next generation rolls on. Xbox then allows developers to have access to a more familiar CPU environment. Microsoft states that most devs will use SMT off for the first wave of games, but in the future they can opt to use more threads as their need for parallelism and familiarity of the machine grows. Sony meanwhile doesn't allow developers to do this. To our current knowledge, they've not stated that you can run with SMT disabled, meaning there's only a choice for 16 threads. Long term, this definitely won't really matter, but in the short term, it may mean that Microsoft Console is easier to optimize for. We'll need to wait for developer feedback here. But if you are a developer and want to give me information in confidence, then feel free to get in touch by either email, Twitter, or whatever you feel comfortable with. So then, I discussed about getting to the clock speed information, and I promise we will, but we do need to discuss GPU first, because with PlayStation, clock frequencies are balanced between CPU and GPU. The GPU in both machines is an AMD RDNA 2 based architecture, and I have said in the past that both Sony and Microsoft have a significant insight into the development of AMD's roadmap. So while both companies have likely influenced both RDNA 2 and 3, this also means that console manufacturers possibly have tech which is not inside the desktop RDNA 2 implementation and may not even appear until RDNA 3. Or they have specific custom implementations in their hardware for their needs. Backwards compatibility mode, for example, runs differently for each console, but we'll get into back compat probably in the second video. While we're at it, there's also a lot of discussion at the moment on social media for DirectX 12 Ultimate. This API is for both PC as well as Xbox. But ultimately, DX12 Ultimate is just the official name for an API, which is incorporating the new feature set of DirectX 12 as well as DirectX ray tracing. I had speculated actually that a lot of updates on Microsoft's blog were likely hinting of what was inside RDNA 2 as well as the upcoming Xbox, and well, this is confirmation that my guess was correct. However, while this tech is very, very cool and definitely awesome, this is not necessarily an advantage to Microsoft. Keeping things simple, again, this is an API. The job of an API is to translate what a game wants into instructions for the driver, which in turn controls the hardware. Vulkan also exists, which is a platform-agnostic API, which can run on Linux, Windows, Nintendo Switch, Mac, your phone, and so on and so on and so on. Recently, it was updated with the very, very DXR Tier 1.1 type of functionality. Indeed, the Vulkan implementation of ray tracing actually allows something that DXR 1.1 cannot do, having the CPU to help out with ray tracing calculations if it has spare cycles available. The PC desktop space is a great candidate here. Now, this is not me putting down Microsoft, or even stating that Sony will use Vulkan. You can actually expect developers to use PlayStation's own API. With the PS4, there was GNM and GNMX. Those two APIs provide both low and high level control for the GPU of the system. Low level gives better performance, but is significantly harder to develop for, as developers need to manage things like memory a lot better than higher level APIs, which allow easier development. So if you're developing like a less graphically intensive game, you don't need lots of performance, you can simply use a higher level API and it's just easier. Once again though, keeping things super simple, this is not an advantage for PS4 either, as DX12 has low and high level access for the Xbox. Instead, don't concern yourself with the API. Really, it's going to be down to the feature set of the hardware itself. The API is not anything to concern yourself with. So, what about the GPU then? We've been beating around the bush a lot. What about the GPU? Sony and Microsoft's approach is very different here, and they both support hardware-based ray tracing. I repeat, hardware-based. This is not software-based for either console. I will keep things once again as simple as possible, but ray tracing is the idea of calculating where light falls in a natural way by tracing rays from various sources of light and figuring out what that light would touch and interact with. In the real world, light would be produced by, let's say, a light bulb, then reflected off of objects and then enter our own eyes. On the other hand, in computer graphics, this is essentially reversed. The camera, our eyes, have rays which would emanate from it, and then geometry, it would be calculated which is visible, and then what light would interact with that geometry. In a nutshell, ray tracing is as old as the hills, and it is very difficult to get running on real time because calculating what light interacts with and how the light would then behave is taxing. It's not enough to simply say this light bulb is lighting up this wall, but it needs to calculate it almost exactly to the pixel. What colours are being transferred from reflective surfaces, and so on and so on. To this end, both consoles and AMD's upcoming RDNA 2 have specific hardware which handles BVH calculation, bounding volume hierarchy. Don't worry exactly what this is, as it's kind of just a sorting structure designed to figure out what light is intersecting with which pixels. This is a very big topic and one that I'll cover further very soon. BVH is what is difficult for the calculation, because this is what's being accelerated with AMD's solution. With RT in the GPU, figuring out what exactly is happening with these expensive calculations. Indeed, it's kind of similar to NVIDIA's Turing architecture. So then, on to another myth. The 13 T-flops and their Xbox are banded about very frequently here, but it is not being understood by the vast majority of people, and quite frankly, even a lot of websites are misreporting this because they're click-hungry. What it means is if you were to run these BVH calculations on compute units, and we'll get to those in just a moment, but these are what makes the flop number of a console, you would need 13 T-flops of raw performance. Or to put it another way, if you were to run all of the BVH calculations, which the RT cores in the Xbox Series X are capable of handling, you would actually still not have enough performance on the GPU. You would be minus 1 T-flop. So to be clear, this is not a second GPU in the console. The RT cores on the Xbox Series X cannot do other things like a regular GPU shader, and this measurement was merely pointing out how impressive the RT cores are in RDNA 2. Or, if you want me to put it another way, you would need a GPU which is 25 T-flops to pull off the same effect if there was no RT cores on the GPU to handle BVH calculations. And remember, Sony's console does have RT cores for its hardware, which is actually similar in terms of RT core per CU as the Xbox, though I want to discuss RT comparisons in a different video for the consoles because it's a very, very large topic. Microsoft's approach though for the GPU is slower and wider, with 52 compute units running at 1825 MHz, with Sony's GPU being 36 compute units hitting up to 2230. Microsoft has the raw performance advantage, 12.1 T-flops versus a peak of 10.28 for the PlayStation 5, although there's a lot more to the GPU than T-flops. Just so you're aware, in each compute unit there's 64 shaders, so for the PlayStation 5 that's a total of 2560, and for the Xbox Series X that's 3328 shaders. But a GPU pipeline needs to be fully utilized for best performance, i.e. you don't want portions of your GPU to simply be sitting there idle. Scheduling work across all of these shaders is incredibly important, so a narrower, faster GPU is easier to fully tax. Higher clocks have the benefit of speeding up other areas of the GPU, such as caches, and there's lots of caches on the GPU, and faster clocks speed those up. Fill rates and geometry will also be pretty damn impressive on the PlayStation 5, but the Xbox does have big advantages. For a start, it has more T-flops, even if the PlayStation 5 can sustain that peak T-flop clock speed. We'll get into that in just a moment. The GPU performance isn't just for drawing stuff on screen, but the GPU already has been confirmed to do other things such as running machine learning for upsampling from lower resolutions, and ultimately, while the RT cores are responsible for bounding volume hierarchy calculations, it's the compute units themselves which actually are responsible for drawing what is happening with ray tracing. I'm stressing I'm trying to keep this video as basic as possible, but I do feel that there's a few reasons to go over some of the more complex topics, albeit briefly, and I'll keep things as simple as possible. As I mentioned a moment ago, T-flops are important, but they're by far not the only metric of a GPU. In a nutshell, and I'm definitely missing lots of elements here, ability to draw geometry, texture fill rate performance, pixel fill rate performance, compression and available bandwidth, cache sizes and speeds, and so much more play a massive role in the performance of a GPU. As of the time I'm recording this video, unfortunately there's lots of elements we don't know about both consoles' GPUs, and this includes the number of ROPs which are responsible for pixel fill rate, basically assembling an image on screen, the number of TMUs, texture mapping units, which are responsible for drawing textures on geometry, and we also do not know things such as cache sizes and lots of other elements, but we can make some guesses, and I'd stress that this information may be inaccurate on my part because it's based on guesses from desktop GPUs from the previous generation. Although I will say there has been a pretty established history by now from AMD. For example, 4 texture mapping units per compute unit have been seen over the past several generations of AMD GPUs, including RDNA 1, Vega, and so on. So let's do some math then. The PlayStation 5 GPU has 36 compute units, and so we can multiply that by 4, giving us 144 TMU for the GPU. Once again, assuming the same configuration of 4 TMU per compute unit as the last several generations. The Xbox is 52 times 4, which is 208. Oh dearie! Microsoft have a really big advantage then, right? Well, yes, until you take account clock frequency. To get the texture fill rate, we need to multiply the number of TMU by the clock frequency. So, we're looking at about 379 gigatexels for the Xbox Series X and 321 gigatexels, or texture fill rate if you prefer, for the PlayStation 5, which again are based on peak clock. Pixel fill rate is difficult to be certain of because the number of ROPs for either console has again not been confirmed. Looking at Vega 64, which has 64 compute units, it has 64 ROPs. Nave 10, which is found in RX 5700 class devices, sports between 36 or 40 compute units, depending if it's RX 5700 or 5700 XT, and it too has 64 ROPs. The question is though, does the Xbox and PlayStation feature the same number of ROPs as this, 64, and is there a difference between one another? The PlayStation 5 does have fewer compute units, 36, which is the same as the RX 5700, so it's possible that the PlayStation 5 has 64 ROPs, but Microsoft's larger GPU has a larger number. I don't feel that this is likely though. I believe they both have the same number, because fewer than 64 ROPs does not make sense for a GPU that's this performance class for the PlayStation 5. And also AMD typically operate with an even number of ROPs. A number of ROPs such as say 96 is something you'd associate with Nvidia. Though to kick my own analysis in the shin there were rumours of Big Nave which has 80 compute units which might sport up to 96 ROPs, but this is sketchy at best and has no evidence. Also, even if the 80 compute unit desktop GPUs do have 96 ROPs, there's a massive delta between 52 compute units of the Xbox and 80 of the desktop. Therefore, the most likely scenario then is the PlayStation 5 has a similar ROP layout to the Xbox Series X, which would actually give the PlayStation 5 an advantage. What about other questions? Well, if we get back to caches, GPUs which are larger typically have more cache. Take Nave 10 and 14. The level 2 caches here, well, the RX 5700, which once again features Nave 10, has 4 megabytes of level 2, whereas the 5500 XT, which has 24 compute units, has just half of this. Microsoft have provided us total cache figures of this SoC for the Xbox Series X, but we cannot know how this is divided between the CPU, GPU, and other components. For example, the level 2 caches of each CPU core is likely 512 kilobytes, meaning up to 4 megabytes total. But there were earlier rumours that level 3 cache for the console GPU is just a quarter of that of the desktop, but again, this is not confirmed. Therefore, we can't know how much cache there is for the GPU yet. Also, we cannot look at the sizes of RDNA 1 because RDNA 2, I'm pretty certain, has much larger and robust caching systems. So again, ultimately there's probably 2 scenarios. If their caches for level 2 are, say, similar, the clock speed advantage of the PS5 GPU gives Sony the edge here, but Microsoft's GPU is larger, so it could have a larger amount of level 2 cache. But the cache would also run slower, but there's more of it, meaning once again, at one way the PlayStation 5 has a win, at other times the Xbox does. I am vastly simplifying this information, of course. For example, to a GPU, of course, there's much more than just level 2 cache. But if you take away nothing else from the last few minutes, take this away. the Xbox design will definitely have advantages in compute-focused tasks, texture performance, and probably ray tracing. Sony's GPU though will have advantages with higher fill rate, faster caches, and likely easier for developers to optimize the pipeline for thanks to fewer compute units to worry about bubbles, i.e. idle times on the GPU. There's also lots of features that I'm not talking about here. I'm not discussing, for example, variable rate shading for the Xbox and PlayStation. All I'll say for now is that by and large, both GPUs will be pretty equal in tech, minus specific customizations in each. After all, they're both using RDNA 2 based silicon, and we've seen that VRS is baked directly into RDNA 2. I will go deeper into VRS and other tech in the future, including how ray tracing compares between systems. But for now, to complicate things further, the Sony machine has a best case scenario for its CPU and GPU thanks to a boost system. With Microsoft, the CPU and GPU run at locked frequency, much like consoles before it, so the performance is steady across the board regardless of workload. The only times you'll see a difference in clock speed is if A, the CPU is running with SMT disabled, where the clock runs at 3800 MHz compared to 36, so once again, developers would flag this if they want their games to run in this mode, or B, if the console has, say, air vents blocked and down clocks, / turns off to save itself, exactly the same as older generation. Meanwhile, Sony has an up to figure for its CPU and GPU, and what's not yet clear is how much of a fluctuation in performance there is when there's a load on either component. To be clear, this is not actually really temperature related, and so isn't quite the same as boost clocks on, let's say, a GPU. Instead, this is more maximum power related. Typically on a console, a clock speed is decided and then the system draws whatever power is required to hit that limit. So as workloads become harder, more power will be drawn, but if a workload's less, once again, lower power will be drawn. But ultimately, the clock frequency remains the same. But with the PlayStation 5, the power budgets are already decided and the SoC itself adjusts accordingly. So the CPU is up to 3500 MHz and the GPU is up to 2230 MHz. But the figures could be lower than this. For example, CPUs can process some instructions which are just more taxing to run than others. Cerny himself gave the example of AVX 256-bit instructions, and as PC overclockers can attest, your system can be all fine and dandy at insane overclocks, but then, boom, you hit it with a heavy AVX workload and it goes nope, and locks up. So this leaves you with a couple of options. You can either reduce the clock frequency, you can get better cooling, you can increase the voltage and run with an AVX offset, where the CPU will run at a lower clock frequency if it's running heavy AVX code. But this is different to what's happening in the PlayStation 5. For overclocking your PC, you could run your 4500 MHz CPU at 5100 MHz, and the AVX might have an offset of 4.9, meaning if there's a heavy AVX workload, the chip goes from 5100 MHz down to just 4900 MHz. With the PlayStation 5, if a heavy AVX workload happens, the chip may reduce clock frequency, and this could either happen to the CPU or the GPU workload. And I've seen lots of figures touted and guessed for this, stating that the PlayStation 5 is a 9.2 T-flop machine, with the GPU boosting up to 10.28 when the APU isn't really doing anything. But I don't really agree with this notion. I'm very skeptical the reduction is that high, as Sony himself stated the reduction in frequency is quite minor. Unfortunately, he did not provide the exact range. He did say that if the power drop to the GPU, for example, dropped by about 10%, it only had a few percent impact on the GPU's clock frequency. Then again, I do not have the figures, and I've not tested this personally. So I'm personally guessing a 3 to 5% worst case scenario. It could be less, it could be more, but in my opinion, he said a few percent, so I usually add a couple of percent on what someone says. So to me, it seems like at worst case scenarios with heavy AVX loads or whatever, the PlayStation 5 could be between high 9 T-flops to low 10 T-flops, let's say 10.1-ish. But I do not know this for certain. And it's going to be interesting, though, how developers will make decisions for the PlayStation 5, because there's also the Smart Shift system. This was first shown off by Renault, which is a chip from AMD. Basically, the CPU runs at lower power consumption and nudges that to the GPU to maintain higher frame rates or better resolution when possible. All of this is automated though, meaning it will be interesting how developers handle this when they're used to essentially locked silicon. As I pointed out, the variances will most likely be small, and during optimization though, even a few percent could be a huge difference. I also hinted that flexible clock speeds were a thing with the PlayStation 5 before, though at the time the person asked me to report it as pure speculation. Though I'm happy that ultimately this proved to be right from, the perspective of my reputation. I'm not necessarily sure how it's going to impact developers, so I'm going to be very curious to see what discussions we have from developers in the longer term. I've also decided to touch on variable rate shading, lower precision floating point operations for the PlayStation 5, because this is inevitably something I'm going to get asked if I don't touch on it here. I will say that at the moment, there are still lots of questions exactly what both consoles are capable of, and it's made even more confusing because AMD themselves haven't exactly outlined what the base features are for RDNA 2. They provided a few insights, and you can see them on screen yourself right now, which seem to be the basic features of RDNA 2, so we can pretty much guess that, yes, those are part of the PlayStation 5 as well. However, exactly what, for example, the custom geometry processing unit is in the PlayStation 5 and how it compares against the Xbox GPU, well, that's still not known. What about lower precision floating point operations like FP4 and FP8? Well, again, it seemed like from Microsoft's comments that they were essentially part of RDNA 2. However, AMD have been very cagey about RDNA 2, so I'm guessing it's part of RDNA 2, which means it would inherently be part of the PlayStation 5 almost certainly, but we don't have enough evidence right now to be 100% conclusive, so I'm gonna say yes with an asterisk of maybe not. The memory system is also quite different from both systems. If you just look at the figures, the PlayStation 5 seems to have a disadvantage. They both are using 16 gigabytes of memory, and therefore people seem to band about 560 gigabytes per second and 448 gigabytes for the Xbox and PlayStation respectively. And some of the tests from the PlayStation 5 infamous GitHub results were actually running at 512 gigabytes per second. One of my sources apparently told me that Sony were internally debating, and putting that kindly, increasing this figure so it would have run at 512 gigabytes rather than 448. I can't confirm this because, well, it was an anonymous source, but according to them, Sony of Japan and Sony of the United States were fighting amongst themselves between the 448 and 512 gigabyte figure. Ultimately, though, we have 448 gigabytes per second. Either way, though, that figure is unified across all of the memory, so all of the RAM runs at 448 gigabytes per second. The Xbox has a rather different take on things, using kind of a split memory configuration, a symmetric memory, with 10 gigabytes of this running at 560 gigabytes per second, and the remaining 6 gigabytes running at just 336 gigabytes per second, which is not exactly slow. This slower memory is where the OS will reside, taking up 2.5 gigabytes. I don't know how much the PlayStation 5's OS takes, but I suspect it's going to be similar, about 2.5 gigabytes. I also will take this opportunity to say that according to Microsoft, one whole physical core of the Xbox is also taken up by the OS. So it's one core, 2 threads, and I assume it'll be the same for the PlayStation, but this was not confirmed. The slower memory pool will be what developers for the Xbox will want to occupy less bandwidth-dependent resources, so say audio data, or data designed to be processed by the CPU, such as AI or game engine stuff in general. Textures, graphics assets will instead want to reside as much as possible in the 10 gigabytes of faster RAM. This split approach, though, is going to be interesting for developers to optimize, and time will tell if it's hard for developers to work with this split pool. While this certainly isn't the Xbox One's ESRAM situation all over again, memory and asset management are big topics in game development, but we don't really have much public documentation of how this works, so how difficult this is for developers to work with. Honestly, it's a mystery. One thing developers do typically like is a single easy-to-use pool of RAM. This was something that developers praised the PlayStation 4 for on launch. Sony, meanwhile, have slower RAM, but it's completely unified. They don't need to worry about, the data is in this pool of memory or that pool of memory. So, really and truly, developers don't need to concern themselves much here. But it's also difficult to know if 448 GB per second will be enough to feed the GPU and other components inside the PlayStation 5. The RX 5700 XT, for example, does have access to the same bandwidth for the PlayStation 5, 448 GB per second, but it also has lower performance figures, thanks to a slower clock. But you also don't need to provide bandwidth to the CPU, which realistically is going to eat up much more than the meager 20 GB per second of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One's CPUs. If you don't believe me, take a look at how fast the RAM you would typically pair with your Ryzen build would be. On the other hand, all of the other stuff inside the console will eat up bandwidth as well, but this could also be offset by the fact that the RDNA 2 based architecture most likely has much better data compression, and compression of data is a big theme for the next generation consoles. We'll discuss this more when talking about SSDs, but long story short, whether 448 GB per second will be a kick in the shin to the PlayStation 5, well, we just won't know. And simultaneously, whether the split memory pool of the Xbox is going to be a pain in the butt to developers, we can only wait and see. Anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, then please, of course, leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us out a ton if you do decide to drop a like and subscribe, because obviously the YouTube algorithm, is the YouTube algorithm. And also, if you'd be so kind as to turn on notifications, that would be even better. You can also find us on social media, which of course is linked in the video description. If you so desire, you can also support us on Patreon, because your support really does help. It not only enables us to purchase hardware, such as, let's say, the 3700X or the RTX 2080 Ti, which have been of paramount importance in our testing, but it also enables us to not worry so much about covering day-to-day news videos and instead focus on analysis like this. So if you can support even $1 a month, I would be very appreciative. However, if you can't contribute on Patreon, which I fully understand, especially with what's going on in the world right now with the uncertainty, you can use, let's say, an Amazon affiliate link, which is once again found in the video description. It doesn't cost you anything, but if you order something, it gives us a few pennies, which of course would be highly appreciated. You can also expect part 2 of this video fairly soon. I'll start writing the script in the next couple of days, along with lots and lots and lots of other stuff for both PC and, of course, the consoles. With all of that said, I thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.